Thank you, Christine, for this kind introduction. I want to express special thanks to the sponsoring organizations, the Center for Security Policy, the Fund for American Studies, and the Americas Forum. I'm very pleased with the attendance tonight. That's terrific job by the sponsoring organizations. Special thanks to Nancy Menges, who is in charge of the Menges Hemispheric Security Project, where I serve as an advisor and as a co-editor of the Americas Report, as Christine mentioned. And of course, very special thanks to Frank Gaffney, President and CEO of the Center for Security Policy, and Christine Brim, Chief Operating Officer at the Center, for their generous support of the Menges Hemispheric Project and for having supported throughout the years our work at the Center. I also would like to thank John Perdue from the Fund for American Studies for helping making tonight's presentation possible. In terms of the book, the reason why I wrote this book was in order to try to make sense of the nature of this phenomenon called Hugo Chavez and his revolution, and the potential implications of this revolution, not only for our region and for the United States, but in general. And my intent was, I was not content with different views of the situation in Latin America, particularly those who define Chavez as a socialist or a populist regime that emerged as a result of the failure of neoliberal policies, free market policies, and they view Chavez only as a reaction to the failure of these free market policies. Most of these explanations are economic. They see Chavez as an economic phenomenon, and they believe that Chavismo, or the rule of Hugo Chavez, is not good, but good lasts as long as oil prices are high. Once oil prices go down, there will no longer be any Bolivarian revolution. I reject that notion because I believe that Hugo Chavez is not only, the Bolivarian revolution that Hugo Chavez initiated is not just a domestic revolution, but it's a transnational revolution. It's a revolution that goes beyond the boundaries of Venezuela, in the same way that, any other totalitarian revolution was, or not necessarily totalitarian, but let's say the communist revolution, the fascist revolution, or the Pan-Arabist revolution, Nasser. I also try to challenge those who claim that the region is going in an irreversible direction of economic proliferation and democracy, and that Chavez and the Bolivarian revolutions are merely exceptions to the rule and only temporary phenomena. I disagree with those views because I believe that those views do not take into account the nature of the revolution, the ideology, the scope, and the actions of what Bolivarianism has done. It's important to point out that the Bolivarian regime is deeply revolutionary, and is an attempt to refound the state, to refound the foundations of the state. Similarly, its domestic revolutionary project is connected to a transnational project. In addition, it has developed relations with countries such as Iran, with organizations such as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. It has established relations with drug cartels, with other rogue states, if you wish, and with China also. So even those who actually point out the finger on those dangerous relations, very often they tend to be informative, they tend to be descriptive. But what I felt was lacking was something that would put all the dots together. The relation between the fact that the Bolivarian revolution is an authoritarian revolution, goes against democracy 30 years after democracy has been restored in Latin America, particularly in the Southern Cone. The fact that this is establishing relations with Iran or with the FARC or with the drug cartels, I try to make sense of all these phenomena altogether, but not only with the objective of explaining that or trying to understand that, but also in trying to project, I'm trying to project future scenarios in order to clarify what, in my view, is the situation in Latin America. So this book's primary intent is to unscramble and make sense of the facts and the reality so that we can have lenses, if you wish, or some sort of theoretical framework through which we can look at the reality of Latin America today. So, the book is comprised by 9 chapters. In the first chapter, I discussed the roots of the Bolivarian Revolution. Not only the roots of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, but also in the countries that actually are following the Venezuelan model, such as Ecuador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, etc. And the explanation that I give to why the Bolivarian Revolution emerged is not necessarily an economic explanation, even though I can identify the economic reasons why it emerged, but mostly I attribute the emergence of these revolutions to the fact that these were very deficient democracies. Parties were unresponsive to constituencies. Democracy was limited to just the act of voting. People would vote for the leaders or the parties would do whatever they want, and then they would wait until the next election. There was no connection. There was not the dimension of representativeness didn't exist. With the with the emergence of democracy early in the 1980s and the 1990s, we had a situation where more and more marginalized groups, including indigenous groups, and other groups that were previously marginalized, all of a sudden come to the political scene and they get mobilized. The political system is unable to absorb these new forces. And what they do is they act in the old way, in the oligarchical way that I described before. And for instance, you have cases such as Lucio Gutierrez in Ecuador that promises everything to the indigenous populations, and they promise to respond to the indigenous populations, and once he comes to power, he does exactly the opposite of what he had promised during the election. So this kind of political behavior, this kind of political structure eventually radicalizes, breaks the system. There is a crisis of legitimacy of the democratic system. It collapses, and that vacuum is filled by new charismatic leaders that actually come out of the establishment, outside the traditional political parties, and fill out that vacuum. In other words, to summarize, the Bolivarian Revolution emerges in Venezuela and in other countries because democracy basically failed. It's not a good democracy. It's not an institutionalized democracy. There is no connection between state and civil society. The state does not respond to civil society. There is no way for integration of forces, of different social forces. And I come back to this issue later at the end of my book. Chapter 2 stresses the nature of the regime founded by Hugo Chavez. And I say that the Bolivarian regime is not a classic populist regime and is not a typical illiberal democracy. Neither, I would say, we can reduce the Venezuelan government as being merely a socialist government. It is also highly ideological, is expansionist, is anti-capitalistic, is anti-democratic, is anti-American. In addition, and that's very important to point out, even though we have elections taking place in those countries. Those elections are mostly